Thank you, Lou, and good morning. For those I haven't met last night or yet today, my name is Alex Trembath, Deputy Director here at Breakthrough. Without any further ado, I just want to welcome our first plenary on Is Quiet, I did it again, I can't say it. Is quiet climate policy enough? Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Can everyone see and hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks. I'm so sorry not to be there in person. Unfortunately, there was an unexpected health event, but I'm grateful to be able to join kind of from the sky, I think, if I know what the stage setup looks like. So that's very fun and a little bit sci-fi and fitting for a breakthrough conference. I'm Shannon Osaka. I'm a climate reporter for GRIST. And today we're going to be talking about quiet climate policy, which I've said a little bit better than Alex. And I first got interested in this idea when I was working on a piece last year about who killed the carbon tax. And the subtitle was it Democrats or Republicans? But for a long time, the carbon tax was kind of the be-all end-all of climate policy. It was thought of as a really major way to address climate change. And what we've seen in the last few years is some real shifts into different modalities and different paradigms of thinking about US climate policy. We've had the Green New Deal, and now we have this idea of quiet climate policy, which some would argue has done the most to actually cut US emissions over the past 20 years. And so Breakthrough defines a policy as quiet if it, quote, swims with the tide of existing socio-political institutions and economic growth, if it uses technology and infrastructure as its main lever, and if it disrupts rather than exploits political partisanship. And in my own reporting and work on this topic, I've thought of it in a little bit of a simpler way. I think of quiet climate policy as something that's far more likely to be a carrot than a stick. So we're thinking incentives and tax credits rather than mandates and carbon taxes. And also, quite frankly, as things that are a little bit too boring to be polarizing. So you're unlikely to see attack ads about the 45Q tax credit. You're unlikely to see protests about EV tax incentives and things like that. But the question that we're going to be looking at in this panel is whether quiet climate policy, which typically takes place through omnibus spending or tucked into reconciliation bills, whether that is sufficient to meet our climate goals, and also whether our climate goals are the right ones. And so joining us today, we have Matt Iglesias, the writer and editor of Slow Boring and senior fellow at the Niskanen Center. We have Marcella Mulholland, political director at Data for Progress and also a former organizer for the Sunrise Movement, and Mark Paul, professor of economics and environmental studies at the New College of Florida. And so I believe that Mark is going to start us off with the presentation. So go ahead, Mark.
Good morning. So I'm actually going to just speak from my chair, but I'm really happy to be here with you all. I first want to thank our organizers for hosting us and making this such a seamless process. So thank you to Thea and everybody else involved. So I'm really glad to be here today to talk with you about the great problem of the 21st century, the climate crisis. These are both terrifying times and exciting times. Let's start with the bad news. As of now, the US does not have a plan to decarbonize. Rather, we're on track for 3C of warming as business as usual, according to reports put out by our gracious hosts. Now, this can't be accepted. That degree of warming would be absolutely devastating. Not only would it cost countless lives, with recent estimates out of Harvard putting pollution associated with the combustion of fossil fuels every year alone responsible for 350,000 American lives, but it would require us to abandon entire cities and countries. It would turbocharge inequality, and it would cause irreparable harm to vital ecosystems. On top of that, as an economist, I assure you it would be economically ruinous. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen called climate change an existential threat to the economy. The National Climate Assessment put out under the Trump administration estimated that it would cost the economy roughly 10% of GDP by the end of the century. And the European Central Bank recently put out a report just last month saying that the only way to address the climate fiscally responsible is to engage in crash decarbonization now. But these dire warnings understate the problem by treating climate as one economic goal among others, rather than as the fundamental condition of our biological and social existence. Despite this, Congress continuously fails to act in the name of fiscal responsibility. But that's enough bad news. For the good news, we can indeed decarbonize rapidly, and we can do so in ways that save lives, creates jobs, improves economic security, and is indeed fiscally responsible. The technology exists, the real resources exist, and I assure you the money exists. Major advancements have been made that ensure achieving net zero is far easier than ever before. Technology has improved drastically and has led to plummeting prices for renewables, storage, EVs, and the like. Although I'm not so sure prices have plummeted yet for nuclear, but I suspect we'll hear much more on that in the coming day. Study after study finds that we can decarbonize sectors such as the electricity sector in ways that not only create millions of jobs, but also save ratepayers money. In other words, addressing the climate crisis is cheaper than status quo. To boot, climate action is broadly popular, although I think Matt has a different reading of the polls. I remember on election day in 2020, Fox News ran a poll showing 70% of Americans wanted more government investment in clean and renewable energy. Now, I will say that's the easier part. Building the green economy is a lot easier than tearing down the fossil fuel economy, which we need to do both of. Further, polls show that including social policy with climate policy, such as a job guarantee, which was central to the introduction of the Green New Deal, actually improves support substantially. And of course, the other thing I'm optimistic about are the climate movements, from the environmental justice movements to youth climate movements that are growing rapidly and that I see as instrumental in advancing the climate agenda. So yeah, these are troubling times, but they're also optimistic times. Now, what set of policies can and should be adopted to get us to where we need to go is the main question for debate. I see three legs to the climate policy stool. The first is investment, the second is regulation, and finally, we have market mechanisms, as Shannon brought up, the almighty carbon tax, which economists have sold as a silver bullet. I also assure you it is not. I believe that all three are needed, however. I see these as complements. I think we far, far too often pit these against each other, thinking we could have regulation or investment, carbon pricing or renewable portfolio standards. I don't see this as an either or, and I hope we can move past that. But if we are to have a rapid and equitable transition, one that improves economic security, particularly for the most vulnerable groups in our society and globally, it must be an investment-led approach. In an economy facing persistent demand shortfalls, weak labor markets, stagnant wages, a public spending program on decarbonization is the sane pathway forward. It'll also, believe it or not, improve supply chains, as we are seeing today. Historically, economists have posited, and unfortunately politicians have bought into, the idea that climate action is simply too costly. In fact, economists won a Nobel Prize in 2018 for arguing 3.5C is optimal by 2100 because we'll be so rich in the future, everything will be okay. Now, I don't think that world is the world we need to live in, nor want to live in. And in fact, we do not need to choose between a robust economic response to climate change and meeting people's material needs now. America's collective capabilities are not fixed. Contrary to orthodox theory, the US economy is not operating at maximum productivity potential and has not done so for decades. We can and should put those unused resources to work to mobilize them to decarbonize today. And that's exactly the program that a Green New Deal is essentially calling for. In terms of investment needs, estimates put these at 3 to 5% of GDP a year for for 10 years to engage in a program of rapid decarbonization. That's about $1 trillion a year. If most of you have been following the news, the reconciliation package is going to get whittled down perhaps to 1.5 trillion. How much of that is climate is TBD. Not much. So in terms of investment, I think that this needs to be public investment driven. However, the federal government also has a substantial role to play in pushing private industry to decarbonize in certain directions. Regulations, some of these will be quiet, but others, such as outright bans on new fossil fuel extraction, are going to be loud. And in terms of market mechanisms, the beauty of a well-designed market mechanisms like a carbon cap and dividend is that we can design it in a way that protects the purchasing power of the vast majority of Americans. And as a matter of fact, end up in a world where most people have to pay absolutely nothing to address climate change. Now, this question on the table asks about if QCP is sufficient. What do we mean by sufficient? Well, can this framework help us limit emissions to 1.5 to 2C as agreed upon in Paris? No, I simply don't see any way in which it can. While QCP may be viewed as the path of least resistance, I really think it's akin to accepting fully preventable climate genocide. That's not a world I'm willing, nor I hope you are, to accept. Second, QCP, as far as I understand it, relies on behind-the-scenes technocratic approach to climate policy. It tries to define what's possible, essentially serving a gatekeeper function. It has been tried for decades, and for decades, it hasn't really worked. Finally, we have to ask if it's sufficient in terms of addressing equity and environmental justice, concerns that I haven't heard mentioned yet at this gathering, and concerns that are inextricably linked from climate policy. I'm not optimistic on that front either. Now, there's work to be done. I don't want to pretend that we're on the brink of passing a Green New Deal. I also don't want to pretend that we're on the brink of passing bipartisan climate policy, quiet or loud. But rather than pitting the two against each other, I think that we should see them as complements as well. I think that some actions are going to be quiet and behind the scenes. Other actions are going to require mass mobilizations and in turn mass movements. I truly believe both are necessary and that they'd be stronger together. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark. And I believe that we are going to move to Matt next.
Yeah, so I think a good place to start is where I agree with Mark, which is, if you look at the IPCC goals, 1.5 degrees of warming relative to pre-industrial climate, you're not going to get there with quiet climate policy. It's just, it's not going to work. And then if you look at, well, what would be required to meet that? It's very dramatic social transformation. I think there might have been a time, if going back to Kyoto, we had engaged in market-based approaches, you probably could have over 30 years gotten us to a place where that was sufficient. But where we are now, you would need very loud changes. And to get those loud changes, you would need a highly engaged mass movement, exactly as Mark said. The problem is that highly engaged mass movement doesn't exist. My read of the landscape isn't that acting on climate is unpopular. There's a very clear support. People think climate change is real. People think the government should do something about it. People support investments in climate change. But as soon as you go to things like in Washington State, right, they tried the kind of neoliberal version of a carbon tax and it failed. So then they went with the more lefty version and it failed. And Washington State is a much more liberal state than the average state. And you do these polls. There's one I like to say, Reuters asked, should the government take aggressive action to tackle climate change? 67% yes. Would you be willing to pay $100 more on your utility bills? 34% yes. And $100 is like nothing, I mean, people spend that all the time on like dumb shit. And personally, I would be thrilled to spend $100 more on my utility bills to address climate change. I mean, I agree with a lot of what Mark said about we should be taking this problem more seriously, more urgently. But the fact is that this is not a top priority for most people. Most people are concerned with immediate short-term impacts on their personal lives. And the worst consequences of climate change accrue in the distant future, and they accrue primarily in lower income countries. Climate justice is an interesting idea, but again, when you look at Democrats, it's upscale Democrats who care more about climate change. Working class Democrats themselves are less concerned about this. What the climate movement has going for it, a really big advantage, is that there's incredible amounts of elite buy-in on climate change. There's incredible amounts of philanthropic funding available for climate-related issues. Everybody who works on any issue knows that like the way to get more funding for your program is to find a climate angle. Corporate America, engages in some very earnest climate efforts and some kind of BS-y greenwashing efforts, but they don't do BS to pretend that they're addressing child poverty, right? Climate is like a hot, sexy, elite issue. And even with Republicans, we have seen the bipartisan infrastructure bill has some climate provisions. The energy bill that passed last year has some climate provisions. If you let the directors of the Council of Economic Advisors from the Bush and Trump and Obama and Biden administrations get together and make policy secretly, they would address climate change much more aggressively than the actual democratic political system does. And that's what quiet climate policy has going for it. It leans into what people like, which is A, you're doing something about climate. B, you're not taking anything away from me. You're giving me some exciting new infrastructure, some new technology. You're promising to bring costs down. It's when you get into the stuff Mark talked about. He gave a great spiel about like investment-led growth and kind of busting through these concepts of a society of limits. And it's like really good, really smart. I totally agree. And then you get to the part where, and we're going to ban new fossil fuel extraction. And it's just the communities where the fossil fuel extraction happens, they really don't want to do that. They're not going to let that happen. And we can have as many panels as we want about how, well, maybe they should, but they don't want to. They're not going to. And I don't think it is, in fact, getting us closer to low emissions to keep running our heads up against that, right? To create whole unwinnable states and districts, to create people who are like, no, fuck you, you're talking about climate. That means you want to ban fossil fuel extraction. And there's so much that we can do, not just in terms of imposing new regulations, but also taking regulations away that are making it harder to cite zero carbon electricity sources, right? I mean, to the extent that if we really want to prioritize climate, if the people who do want to prioritize climate sort of go to the table and work diligently at every lever that we have, we can in fact make progress. And it's important to remember, of course, also that this is a global issue and that fundamentally what we do in the United States that's negative in terms of taking things away, that reduces emissions, but it doesn't change the global picture. Whereas what we do that's additive, when we create new technologies, when we learn by doing, that does impact the global picture because other countries can use that technology and go on and really move the needle in a more dramatic way. So fundamentally, I mean, is quiet climate policy enough? No. But in some ways, like nothing is ever enough. Social Security, when it launched, was not enough. It was expanded like a half dozen times. That's really good. We still have elder poverty in the United States. Like it's not enough, but it's a big achievement. It's done a lot of good. It's helped the world. And I think that quiet climate policy is, in fact, the best policy lever that we have to do the most good that we can on the time frame that we actually have. And this politics of reasoning backwards from a quantitative target has not actually gotten us anywhere over the past 30 years. And at some point, we kind of need to let it go.
I'm here in Seattle, and Washington State actually did pass a cap and trade bill earlier this year, although it was through the legislature, not through public votes. So perhaps the lesson from that is don't try to get the public to vote on a carbon tax. But we might talk more about that a little bit later. Let's hear from Marcella now.
Thanks so much. To start off, I'd like to give a bit of a bit of background on myself and the experiences that inform my perspective on the questions at hand. As you can see from the slide, I'm originally from the great, now super spreader swing state of Florida. I grew up living on the coast, dealing with the impacts of climate change, and became politicized in college after Trump was elected. My sophomore year, I joined a then nascent and largely unknown climate group called the Sunrise Movement. And after college, I sought to translate my organizing experience into tangible policy work. I now work at Data for Progress, a leading think tank and pollster on climate issues and public opinion. And DFP occupies a unique role in the political ecosystem. One day, I am outside of the White House with Sunrise demanding a civilian climate corps, and the other, we're working with economists publishing memos specifically tailored toward getting our friend Senator Joe Manchin to support the Clean Electricity Performance Program. We work behind the scenes with senators to improve climate provisions in bills that don't get many headlines, what some would call quiet climate policy. This straddling of two different theories of change illustrate the thesis which I'd like to present today in response to the question, is quiet climate policy enough? Quiet climate policy is not enough. Instead, we must pursue both loud and quiet climate policy to meet our emissions reduction targets. To be sure, quiet climate policy can move the ball forward in instances when Democrats are not in power, but the unfortunate reality is that piecemeal increases in funding to innovation and infrastructure and small, quiet, bipartisan wins do not come even close to meeting the scale of the climate crisis. Indeed, according to analysis from the Center for American Progress, 94% of emissions reductions in President Biden's budget come from the Build Back Better Act. Just 6% come from the bipartisan deal. And the Center for Strategic and International Studies, certainly far from left-wing, says that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the bipartisan deal, is an arguably unprecedented step in the right direction. However, as a climate strategy to meet the immediate goals of a rapidly dwindling carbon budget, it is a dereliction of duty. So why is this the case? Well, climate is a cumulative emissions problem. Every year that passes where we don't make progress on climate makes the curve to zero steeper and steeper, as you can see here in this chart. Sure, the quiet climate policy investments in the bipartisan deal are important for innovation of technologies that might be needed to get all the way to zero in 2040 or beyond. But we won't even be in the game in 2040 if we don't dramatically reduce emissions today. And to deploy clean energy and transform our economy that quickly, you need to actually disrupt business as usual. You need loud climate policy. In other words, quiet climate policy has severe limitations and can only go so far. At some point, you need a political party to stake real political capital behind addressing climate change. You need loud climate policy too. Good thing, you could do both. We can view loud climate policy and quiet climate policy as a both and situation, not either or. We can approach this with a positive sum solutions oriented perspective, as my boss likes to say. We can acknowledge the climate investments in the bipartisan deal while also supporting House progressives demanding that it be accompanied by a reconciliation package. We can publicly praise the good parts of the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act while also pushing for Congress to pass a clean electricity performance program. In short, we can support quiet climate policy when it's our only option, while also fighting like hell for Democrats to make the most of their governing majority. Let's debunk the idea that we have to choose between quiet climate policy or loud climate policy. One of the most recent examples of quiet climate policy is the Murkowski-Manchin deal at the end of Trump's term that authorized $500 million toward research programs focused on clean energy manufacturing. Now, this deal is notable not only because it passed during the Trump presidency, it also passed during the height of the Sunrise Movement's organizing. At the same time that this funding bill passed, Sunrise was doing actions across the country. None, to my knowledge, were focused on opposing this deal. This goes to show that the theories of change of loud and quiet climate policy are not in conflict. In fact, they can work in tandem. The folks pushing for loud climate policy create room for quiet climate policy to advance. They shift the political terrain and the scope of political possibility in a way that opens up space for all kinds of climate policy to move forward. Nowadays, at least in part thanks to the organizing of our loud climate policy friends, We have a trifecta with the president, Senate Majority Leader, and Speaker of the House who regularly invoke phrases like climate emergency and climate crisis. This would have been unfathomable in the last Democratic administration. Nowadays, the White House basically copy-pastes from the Sunrise Movement's mission statement, as you can see here in screenshots from both of their websites. This didn't happen out of nowhere. This happened because a group of young people, including a younger, balder, more idealist version of myself, sat in Speaker Pelosi's office demanding that Democrats prioritize climate action. It happened because the left backed Bernie Sanders in the primary. And while we lost, we gained leverage in the Biden-Sanders unity task forces, and Senator Sanders is now the Senate Budget Committee chairman. It happened because Chuck Schumer is maybe just a little bit nervous about being primaried by a certain high-profile congresswoman from Queens. And it happened because the left organized and helped deliver truly miraculous wins in the Georgia Senate runoffs. Say what you will about the loud climate policy crew, but they've approached the infrastructure fight quite strategically. For instance, the Sunrise Movement's main campaign has been fighting for a civilian climate corps, a policy that weaves climate, jobs, and infrastructure together, exactly what polling says is the most popular way to approach climate. This civilian climate corps campaign is helpful equally for what it does say as for what it does not. Notice that Sunrise didn't make the Clean Electricity Performance Program, the most important climate policy for reducing emissions in the infrastructure package, their rallying cry. It's actually extremely helpful that there aren't t-shirts and signs with CEPP printed on them, although I am guessing maybe some folks in this room, I know I would wear those shirts. That gives moderates room to get behind the policy without being perceived as ceding ground to progressives. Both and. So while some might ask, what is the climate left doing? I would say what the climate left is doing is fundamentally changing how the Democratic Party approaches climate change. But to close, I'd like to go back to the question guiding this panel. Is quiet climate policy enough? Now, you've heard what I think, but in true pollster form, I'd like to give the last word here to the voters. The question, is quiet climate policy enough, has actually been asked before in surveys and in elections. And poll after poll shows that an increasing part of the electorate wants the government to act on climate. I'm not going to walk you through all of them, but here are the polls. And after all, President Biden didn't win on a plan to pursue quiet climate policy. He won on a platform that promised to bring about, and I quote, a clean energy revolution. What these make clear is that a non-trivial number of Americans do indeed care about climate change, and they want the government to act ambitiously, indeed loudly, to tackle the problem. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marcella. And I think I want to first turn our conversation a little bit back in time, because I think it will be helpful for thinking about where we are now. As many of us know, the last really big attempt to pass climate policy in the US was the Waxman-Markey Act, which notoriously failed. And there was a sociologist who wrote sort of a post-mortem on that act, Theda Skocpol. And she basically argued that the problem of Waxman-Markey was that it was too much of an elite project, and that there really needed to be a grassroots mobilization in order to move forward on the issue of climate. And I think that we've been hearing sort of some different perspectives on this from the panel. And so I just kind of want to hear, and I think I might turn to Matt first here, but is the current move in climate policy, does this constitute a real grassroots mobilization? And should we consider the reconciliation bill a result of that? Or should we consider the reconciliation bill more of an elite project and more of a quiet climate policy project rather than a loud one? So let's turn to Matt first.
Yeah, I think the reconciliation bill is an interesting, ambiguous case in this framework, right? Because the CEPP, which, as Marcella said, is really the driver of emissions reductions in this proposal, is, I think, a classic loud in the breakthrough framework, right? This is not just sort of rolling downhill with things. It's a forceful measure, saying no, cracking down on fossil fuel usage. At the same time, the politics through which this is being constructed is not the Waxman-Markey way, which was like front-loading, here's a big climate bill. It's also not genuinely like a grassroots mass movement out there demanding CEPP. It's kind of like, you slather a pill with peanut butter to get your dog to take it, right? Or it's like a magician's trick. There's like a million different things happening in this reconciliation package, and also a big regulation on electricity utilities. As Marcella outlined, even when the left-wing climate groups are like, we're out here, we're making a bold demand on climate, it's this Climate Conservation Corps thing whose actual climate benefits are like kind of tenuous, and is itself, as she described it, a kind of hide the ball move to let moderates kind of come in quietly and do this more aggressive policy. So it's an interesting idea, but to me, it refutes the notion that this has been driven by a grassroots movement. Because if it was, right, if it was the case that the masses were out there demanding that we require electricity utilities to decarbonize, that would be the emphasized aspect of the package. Whether they admit it or not, and I never ask people to admit that they're wrong because they don't like to, they are implicitly conceding that they are wrong, that they have not conjured up the mass movement that the Scotch poll called for, and that they are going to try to get it done anyway. And honestly, I hope that they succeed. But whether they succeed or not in that is dependent 100% on the goodwill of Joe Manchin. Right? Like everybody knows it is not the case that his constituents are up in arms demanding that he shut down the coal industry. He might agree to do it anyway because it's the right thing to do, and he knows that, and persuasive people have talked to him, but he also might not. But it's really fundamentally a kind of elite-led project, and I'm not sure how ultimately successful it will be, because that analysis that you needed a mass movement to get it done in this way, I think might be correct. And that has been the power of quiet initiatives. And I think I saw in both Mark and Marcella's presentations, there's a little bit of ambiguity around this. Like on one of Marcella's charts, she's showing, voters trust the Democratic Party on climate. And it's like clean energy overwhelmingly for Democrats, a bunch of other stuff. Then on the question of fossil fuels, Democrats were at 40%. Right? And that's because this is the thing that voters don't want us to do. Voters don't want their gas stove taken away from them. They don't want to be told that they can't drive a pickup truck. Right? And now if we can do things on the investment side that make it possible for people to drive an amazing truck that's electric powered, that's great. Everybody likes that. Nobody likes paying for gasoline. But the support for the model in which, there's a nefarious fossil fuel lobby that the voters are against, and that if we can mobilize the people, we can break their power, that's just wrong. People enjoy their energy sources, and they want more and cheaper energy and not to have things taken away from them.
I see Mark holding back some comments.
Give it to me.
So, I mean, there's so much to unpack here. Where to begin? So, I mean, first of all, let me throw it. I'm somebody who identifies as on the left, and let me throw it back on the left for just a second here. I think that we've engaged in a tremendous amount of successful mobilization. Biden moved to the left after winning the primary because of the climate left. Right? He would not have done that otherwise. Candidates win the primary, they move to the center. Biden did the opposite, and he won. Okay. Now, why is that? I do think it's because we've built a powerful climate movement. I do think it's because environmental justice groups are in the streets, are getting to their legislators. But I think that there's a huge amount of work to be done. Let's not pretend that the climate left has built sufficient power to pass a Green New Deal. That is not where we are. So I think that we need to be honest about that fact. Now, is the current reconciliation bill a climate bill? No. I mean, we're talking about 10% of the spending in the bill is dedicated to climate. I mean, this is a social welfare bill. This is a bill aimed at, funding healthcare, at funding education, at funding childcare, things of these matters. But would those climate provisions have even been in there in an alternative world where groups like Sunrise didn't mobilize? I certainly don't think so. And would those provisions survive? So that's, of course, to be determined. But I'm pretty confident a fair number of climate provisions are going to survive. Now, Matt said people like their energy sources. I completely disagree with that statement, actually. People like energy. They like energy that's consistent, but they don't care what fuels their energy most of the time when they flip their light switch on. They want it to work. They want to stay cool in the summer and stay warm in the winter, and that's about it. So it's up to government policymakers to ensure that that electricity source is clean and renewable. They do that. I agree a bit with Matt here that the fight should be less on dismantling the fossil fuel economy, which is necessary, but foregrounding the benefits by creating jobs, specifically in places like West Virginia through smart industrial policy, is exactly the way we get people like Joe Manchin to go along with climate policy. You know how many coal jobs there are in the United States? 42,000. TJ Maxx employs more than 3 times that number of people. I mean, come on, like the coal industry is pretty insignificant with the exception of they hold enormous sway with people like Manchin. So I think that it's really up to us to foreground the investment-led approach, which is precisely the approach that progressives put on the table. I mean, before the progressive movement, this was all about, addressing climate change through belt-tightening policies. I mean, really, climate change was another form of austerity. It's about carbon taxes and what should we do with that revenue? We should give it to corporate tax cuts. I mean, really, that's what we were talking about just 5-6 years ago. So I think the terms of the conversation have changed. I think they've changed for the better. I don't think it's an easy uphill climb, but I think we're set on the right path, and it's going to be a struggle moving forward. I mean, the New Deal didn't just happen. It happened through over 100 pieces of legislation and a massive ramp up in strike activity, not before Roosevelt took office, but during his entire administration. And I think we need to see similar mobilization today if we actually want to get climate policy done successfully.
Marcella, I want to give you a chance to respond, but I also want to ask a little bit about something that you brought up in your talk, which is this inside versus outside strategizing, right? So outside strategizing in terms of being outside, protesting for something like the CCC versus the inside strategizing over the CEPP, the Clean Electricity Payment Plan, and that kind of maneuvering. And I'm sort of curious about the decisions on the part of many activists and progressives on the left to not push really hard on the CEPP, to not be out in the streets saying this is the program that we need. And I'm curious if you can illuminate that a little bit for me.
Yeah, I guess to start off, I'll say I don't work for Sunrise Movement. I once did, so I can't speak to their internal decision-making processes. But I would say the fact that they chose the CCC to be their main movement demand is not them conceding that these other climate policies are unpopular. In fact, I think it's just them being politically savvy. That's how politics is, right? You have to choose what you're going to talk about publicly. You should choose what is most popular to emphasize. You should choose it based off of who your audience is. And the reality is that Sunrise is a youth movement, and trying to get people excited about incentivizing utility companies is frankly harder than getting them excited about a civilian climate corps that is inspiring, has these iconic images from the New Deal era of people in hard hats, like working in our national parks. It invokes much more energy and enthusiasm than these other policies that are more important for reducing emissions. So I think that speaks to their political savviness, not to any really significant concessions on their part. And in fact, Data for Progress has been polling the CEPP for about a year now and finds that when you describe it to voters as a process to incentivize utility companies to get more of their energy from clean sources, it's really popular. And additionally, I would add to Matt's point about banning fossil fuels being less popular than talking about clean energy. True. But also fossil fuel companies are not popular among the electorate. People don't have favorable views on Exxon and Chevron. Even in states like where I'm from, Florida, people, though they have interesting political views there, they have also experienced oil and gas spills that have wreaked havoc on local economies and ecosystems. And these companies are not viewed favorably, and neither are their leaders. And I also would add a point here that Data for Progress polled Trump 2016 voters who were going into 2020 undecided, and we polled them on their views on different issues like immigration, healthcare, climate. And what we found is that this group of maybe swing voters, as some might call them, were most closely aligned to Democrats on the issue of climate change. And this was specifically true for young Republicans and independents. So I think what that shows is that to the extent that the Democratic Party can make elections about climate, a little bit hard when you're in the middle of a global pandemic, but to the extent that we can make climate a central issue, I think that that would be favorable for us amongst independents and specifically young Republicans, in addition to our base.
So there seems to be consensus on the panel that quiet climate policy will not be enough in terms of reaching what we might call our climate deadlines. So ever since the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees, there's been this circulating narrative, we have 12 years, we have 10 years, we now have maybe 9 years to cut emissions by around 50% in order to hit the 1.5 degree target that science says that we should meet. And Matt brought this up as sort of this, sense of reasoning backwards from where we need to be. But I just want to ask the panel, how important are these targets? How much should we be thinking about them in terms of shaping our own US policy? And let's start with you, Mark.
So I think we have to ask the question is, why do we talk about these targets? And are they beneficial and for what? And also, in what instances might they be slightly unhelpful? So first of all, climate change, our understanding of climate change starts with the climate science. And really what the IPCC is doing is summarizing the climate science and providing it to us to digest it and to realize, okay, this is what is needed to limit, to have a 66% chance of limiting warming at 1.5 C. That's all they're saying. They're not saying these are the policies needed. They're just giving us the emissions budget that is left. So in that sense, I think that it's incredibly helpful. I don't think most people realized that we were going to have to transform our entire society now, in this generation. They kept thinking it was about the grandchildren. They kept thinking it was about the polar bears. And so in that sense, I think these targets are incredibly useful for helping people envision just how transformative of the changes we need are. That said, I think, positing that, hey, if we don't address climate change in this bill, the Earth is over, I don't think is helpful. There are going to be many bites at the apple. We are not going to pass one bill that is going to address climate change. We are going to pass dozens, if not hundreds of bills that are going to pass that will address climate change, although Congress is becoming quite terrible at passing bills writ large, which should be concerning for the climate movement. So I think that they're helpful for helping us understand the timeline, but I don't think that we want to use them to a degree that really paralyzes people into just complete despair, because I don't think that is helpful. The question is how to use these timelines to galvanize voters to act today.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair response, and I think that what we have seen is a lot of use of the deadlines in the way that you just said, in terms of this is our last best chance. We hear that pretty much every year, and I think Marcella showed a graphic, one of those graphics of the steeper and steeper necessary emissions cuts. And that does, personally, that worries me a little bit, because what happens when we get to 2030, we haven't made the necessary emissions cuts, and you have people thinking, okay, well, I guess, my children and grandchildren are just going to die now. That is something that I hear from people. I'm curious, Matt or Marcella, if you want to respond.
I think everyone who has thought about this has come to the same conclusion as Mark, that instilling in people this sense of like a one or done tipping point is not that helpful. That's not how the world works. It's not even actually what the IPCC is saying. Like 1.6 degrees of warming is not that different from 1.5. It's different, but it's like every little bit matters, right? And if you go over the goal, it matters by how much do you go over the goal, right? So you want to reduce emissions, you want to reduce them as much as possible, as quickly as possible, and you got to do what you can do. What I think is interesting has been that this doomsday rhetoric has not been effective even inside the progressive coalition at getting people to really, really, really prioritize emissions reduction. It hasn't stopped people from campaigning to shut down existing nuclear sources. Jim Risch has a bill to sort of make permitting for geothermal exploration on public lands easier. And environmental groups still, like, they don't want to question the sanctity of NEPA, even though this would unquestionably reduce emissions. They have other things that they themselves care about. And so if it doesn't cause, like, even environmental organizations to put absolute priority on zero emissions, like, who else is it going to cause to adopt that mentality, right? So we have this kind of paradox of rhetorical escalation since that report, but nothing, it's not that we have made no progress since then, but there hasn't been some kind of attitudinal sea change resulting from it. So I think politics is sort of just like one damn thing after another. And we have done a good job of, like, trying to bolt climate provisions onto every major bill that kind of comes through. And I think that's smart. That has borne some fruit, and I think will continue to bear fruit in the future. But it's not going to be like our last best chance. Like, that will never happen. We're just going to keep plugging away.
I mean, I don't disagree with anything that Matt and Mark said on this question. I think I disagree on one thing. I do think there is a big difference between 1.5 and 1.6 degrees of warming, and it's potentially hundreds of thousands of lives, and we should do everything we can to limit all of warming as much as we can. I think the 12 years framework that we had after the IPCC report in 2018, I have a shirt that says 12 years, period. It's supposed to be dramatic. And I think...
Did you get a new one?
I didn't.
8 years?
I should get, it's the countdown, it's ticking. And I think the point of it is like my co-panelist said, it's rhetorical mostly. And I think it's meant to instill urgency now, but ultimately 12 years from now, we should still be doing everything we can to limit global warming. So I'll have a new shirt then, I guess.
0 years left. So we're talking about this, Mark brought up these sort of 3 pillars, or the stool that he thinks is representative of climate policy. And I want to talk a little bit about staging, because right now in the US, about a quarter of our emissions are still from electricity, which on the one hand seems like, okay, we've made very little progress. On the other hand, it's sort of good news because it means that there's still low-hanging fruit that can be picked. Whereas if we move to someplace like Europe and certain countries, the emissions from electricity are basically gone, and we're thinking about things like transport, buildings, agriculture. And so my question is, will quiet climate policy, will these sort of techniques still be possible then? Or will we need to see, God forbid in the US context, lifestyle changes, or at the very least, more rigorous standards or emission limits? And so who wants to speak? Mark, do you want to speak first, or?
Sure. I think everybody can hear me. This is a great question. So first of all, let's be honest about where we are in the US. I've heard it said that QCP has helped us get to where we are. Our emissions per capita in the US is still about 3 times higher than it is in Europe. Okay, this is a catastrophic problem here. Have we made progress? Sure. Most of that progress, though, has come by locking in natural gas infrastructure, and also has just been not even come close to bringing us in line with other high-income countries. So there's a tremendous amount to be done. In terms of, can quiet climate policy help in other areas? I actually think it can. So buildings are a great example. Buildings are responsible for 40% of emissions in the United States. Building codes, I think, are a great example of a quiet climate policy that can do a tremendous amount. People don't think about them. They're fairly wonky. And it's actually not that hard of a policy to implement. That said, I think that the government can help those being adopted quite a bit by investing in green building technology, helping that be scalable, helping with training so that general contractors actually know how to better insulate buildings, how to opt for triple pane windows, all sorts of things like that. So I think that there is still sizable roles for quiet climate policy across the spectrum. Or R&D is another great example. So ARPA-E has been a wonderful program here in the United States. Their funding is essentially nothing. I mean, it's a joke. It's about $300 million a year. We should increase that orders of magnitude. Is that quiet climate policy? I'm not quite sure what quiet climate policy is, to be frank. But maybe quadrupling R&D or some is another good example, because industry is a hard to abate sector, and substantial investments in R&D are going to be essential if we're going to address those last 10-15% of emissions.
I could go on about housing and buildings forever, so I will try not to. One thing that this does make me think, though, right, is that sometimes what we do is we kind of chunk this out by sector, and then we say, okay, in the electricity sector, we have the technology that we need to get to zero emissions, so all we need to do is just go deploy it. When you think about other sectors, though, right, if you think about decarbonizing buildings, you think about decarbonizing transport, you're talking primarily about converting these things to electricity, right? So we're going to have heat pumps, we're going to have EVs. The technology is maybe like not 100% there, but it's close, and we're getting there. We could be rolling this out, but that means a huge increase in electricity demand. And so taking electricity as a fixed pie and then kind of shrinking the fossil fuel share of that isn't really the whole ballgame. Like, we need more zero carbon electricity than looking at the electrical sector alone would suggest, which again, I think is a case for investments being relatively more important than regulation there. And then, of course, in the industrial and agriculture sector, it's genuinely all about investment. Like, we need to find some new ways to make steel and concrete. Like, we're not going to get it done by, like, electrical coils can't melt steel beams, to use a turn of phrase. So like we need to come up with something there, right? And like, taking the problem seriously really does mean an investment-led approach. And you could paint a nice picture to people. Like, it's not just for climate reasons. It would be way better if we could make stuff without burning lots and lots of dirty fuels. I think everybody can accept that, but we need to like find a way to do it.
I mean, I agree with that. I think there is low-hanging fruit here, particularly with the power sector. But when you think about the industrial sector, processes to make cement and steel, to your point, these are areas where we really need to be building out our innovation capacity and where R&D is really necessary. And I think the climate movement likes to emphasize the low-hanging fruit part of this, and rightfully so. There's a lot that we know how to do already that we could be doing that we are not doing. But there are more tougher sectors of the economy where we need to be doing more research into, where we don't know exactly how we will successfully decarbonize them. And that's an uncomfortable truth. And it also calls on us, I think, to be critical in what our demands are here. And innovation is necessary for some of these tougher to decarbonize sectors.
I think something that we've been kind of wrestling with on this panel is this idea between, okay, mass mobilization versus what are ultimately pretty boring policies that are difficult for people to get excited about. And so I want to ask how we can, I mean, we were thinking about this reconciliation bill, which is obviously completely up in the air at the moment. We don't know what it's going to look like. We don't know how many emissions it's going to cut, if it's going to pass at all. And so how do we maintain, I think with the exception of Matt, I think most on the panel agree that the climate movement has at least sort of shifted the Overton window about what we think is possible in terms of spending money on climate. But how can that momentum be maintained when we're moving into these other sectors where people might not care so much, where it is very technologically and technically complex, and it might not necessarily be something that people can definitely mobilize around? And Marcel, let's go to you first.
Yeah, I mean, I think you there are ways to frame climate policy that are more popular than others, emphasizing air and water pollution, innovation, really popular ways to talk to the public about these issues. And I think if you don't necessarily need mass mobilization behind the CEPP to get it passed. What you need is elected officials to understand that there is political and an electoral constituency supportive of climate action. And I think that does definitively shift the Overton window. The way that we saw Democrats talking about climate change in the last 2 years is markedly different than we did in the prior decade. And so I think the question of mass mobilization here doesn't necessarily have to be tied to decarbonizing cement. I don't think you need to have a protest outside of the White House about that specifically. What you need is Joe Biden and leadership in Congress to understand that if they don't pass climate legislation, there will be electoral consequences for that. And I think this speaks to kind of the theories of change working in tandem. You can have the loud climate policy folks building political momentum, shifting public narrative, getting media coverage on climate, and then you can have technocrats kind of working in the background on these less sexy issues related to cement and otherwise. And I feel like that really is kind of the thesis that I was trying to propose, is like these two theories of change work best in tandem. They're not in conflict, even when the loud climate policy folks are being critical of people on the inside and elected officials. I don't think that that's particularly harmful. In fact, I think it can have really beneficial consequences on both politics and policy. I think primaries here are a good example. Like Chuck Schumer, the election of AOC really had rippling consequences across the Democratic caucus in races that she will never run in, because it made incumbent Democrats a little bit afraid of being primaried from the left. And the far-reaching consequences of that, even onto Chuck Schumer, are really beneficial for the climate movement overall and getting climate legislation passed.
So this is where I need to put my economist brain on for a second. I'm a huge believer in carbon pricing as one of the mechanisms to help us get us there. I think it was a mistake that we sold it as a silver bullet. I think it would be a mistake if we tried to lead with it. I think we need to lead with investments and show people that we can create jobs, that we can stabilize their electricity bills, that we can make their homes more comfortable, and things of this nature first. But if we pass a fairly straightforward policy called the carbon cap and dividend policy, we can simply set an emissions trajectory, with the cap ratcheting down 7 to 8% a year to ensure we decarbonize by, say, 2050 or 2045 or 2055, whatever it is we end up agreeing on. And that will actually make it a lot easier, I think, for the infilling of other policies to address some of these sectors that are, both harder to abate today, but also maybe a little less sexy for Congress to address. All of a sudden, if you have a carbon cap and dividend policy, you're going to get pressure from different industries for Congress to help them, whether that's ramping up massive R&D or other mechanisms to ensure that their industry transitions successfully and doesn't become part of the past. They don't lose market share to, say, cross-laminate timber or other building sectors, things of this nature. So I think that's a policy that deserves a lot more attention and really functions not as a policy to lead with, but as a insurance policy for the climate. And I have to say, before I was an economist, I was a chef. I never thought I would give up my gas stove over my dead body. And then I cooked on an induction stove, and let me say, y'all got to get induction stoves. They are amazing.
There you go. I just want to close though with a plea that I don't disagree with what Marcella said, but I think that the nerdy shit can get underrated in sort of the climate conversation. That I've had just at this conference really great conversations with people about state public utility commissions being an impediment to the location of interregional electricity transmission lines, about the way the Nuclear Regulatory Commission process works impeding the development of small modular reactors, about historic preservation laws impeding the upgrading of buildings to be better insulated and things like that. There's just dozens and dozens and dozens of technical aspects of the way our economy works, the way our regulatory state works, that are really, really important to the mass deployment of these technologies when they are developed. And that like investment is necessary to that kind of stuff, but you can't just like invest your way alone to the end. The Green New Deal is a powerful metaphor for some people, but the New Deal happened at a time when the administrative state like didn't exist, and it was much more of a blue sky universe. You couldn't literally do New Deal stuff today, and to get there, we need to like change a lot of things that are really inherently inside. It's not reasonable to ask like the man in the street to have really strong opinions about what level of government should authorize the location of electricity transmission lines. But that's okay. That it's like not all of politics has to be this like romantic crusade, right? That like we're working on this stuff, we're trying to find solutions, we're trying to get it done, and like that's great.
All right, I think we can tell by the microphones being taken from Marcel that we're going to go to audience questions now. So I'll let the roaming microphone holders take it away.
And can folks hear me? Excuse me. So what we're going to try and do is take 2 or 3 questions at once. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and then Ted or I can hand you the mic.
Thank you. Really great panel. I'm Shelley Fiddler from a Washington, D.C. energy law firm. I was fascinated that you talked about ARPA-E, which is a wonderful small program, but nobody mentioned the loan guarantee program at DOE, where there really is real money. And I'm interested as to whether or not, first of all, whether Jigger Shaw can make it happen is, I don't know. But it's really big money.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
I wanted to ask the question because I can take out my mask. Let's see how we changed our lifestyle, right? Why are you so afraid of changing the lifestyle? 20 years back when I was in Lawrence Berkeley Lab, so my US friends said that it's so difficult in US to introduce LED and CFL because they're white and we like yellow lights. The technologists innovated that. And now everybody has LED lights. But we can't change our lifestyle unless we have an infrastructure. I was walking in the paths of the San Jose this time, and I saw that they have designated a roadside for cycling, and people are cycling. So we need infrastructure, we need technology, and which can lead to the lifestyle change. We got an example that how I changed to the induction cooker from a gas stove. It's the service which I want. I want to cook better. That's it, right? So I think the fear of lifestyle change, we are creating a narrative, is another killer of any climate policy. So I think we need to think a little bit. And also the 1.5 degree was not an IPCC's target. That was a political target decided in Paris. And the science came up to show that what scientists are talking about, whether 1.5 is possible or not. And so it was shown that it is possible scientifically, given all the technologies, the way we do our life, the way we live. So I think the narrative need to come with that lifestyle change is not a fear, which we are living with. When I see the vegan movement, I mean, if you ask a vegetarian to move from vegetarianism to animal protein eating, that's a real punishment. But people have moved out to be vegan. So I see these are the quiet climate policies, I would say. These movements have really changed our society, but we do need loud policies, as you all have said. Thank you very much. I just wanted to comment, not a question.
Thank you.
I'm all about taking that mask off too. She's a leader. I kind of wanted to just piggyback off of her sentiments, which is at what point is climate policy a disservice to the climate movement? Because you have all of these politicians working in the background to integrate climate policy into their legislation, but then they're not publicly talking about it. At what point does that start to take away from the climate movement and, the the trajectory that it's on if people are willing to do it in the background but not talk about it publicly, not be a champion, not even a champion, but just say, yeah, putting this into what I think is necessary for the bill because of A, B, and C. At what point does that start to take away from it all? I hope that made sense. I rambled a bit.
So
Let's go to the panel, and also for future questions, if people can just also introduce themselves so we know who's asking. That would be great.
I'm so glad you asked the question about the loan guarantee, because unfortunately, one of the things that I cut from my talk when I realized I only had a few minutes was credit policy. Transitions require a tremendous amount of risk. Private industry does not like risk. One of the government's largest roles in intervening in the economy is managing risk. One way we do that is through credit policy, whether that be loan guarantees or managing interest rates, both of which are vital if we are to transition successfully and affordably. I wrote a piece for MIT Tech Review entitled provocatively, "We Need More Solyndras." Solyndra was a success story. If you go to a venture capital firm and they have a 100% success rate, no firms fail, they're not taking enough risk. The government ran a program, made money for taxpayers, which should not have been the point, and created a tremendous amount of successful green technology firms. Sure, a couple went belly up, but that's the point. If you only invest in winners, you're not taking nearly enough shots. So yeah, I think credit policy is actually an interesting example. Is it quiet? I'm actually not sure, maybe. But a credit policy is a good example of something that actually doesn't require a lot of financial outlays, but is something that could be leveraged as a massive lift in this effort. So it's something that I think policymakers should be paying a lot more attention to, and creating a massive green public bank to leverage the borrowing capacity of the US government would be tremendously beneficial, both to private industry, but also across scales of government. Local governments borrow at 6%. The US federal government borrows at 1.5%. That could save a tremendous amount of money and allow decarbonization to occur much faster.
I'm super enthusiastic about loan guarantees. I think they're great. It's also a great budget gimmick. And my real advice to members of Congress would be like, if you have X, like make it loan guarantees. You can make it 50X. Lifestyle change it's tricky, right? Because it's easy. Like I live in the city. I live in a walkable neighborhood. I go every place on foot. I've got a bike. I go some places there. I take the bus places. I think it's great. I think I'm great. I'm a climate hero. And then we can come up and just like lecture normal people, be like, well, you should be like Iglesias, right? And that's like that's dodgy issue. Not because like lifestyle change is hard, but because like I think that's part of the cultural resistance to climate politics. It's like people don't want to be just lectured to by a bunch of weirdos who live in New York and Washington about how they're better than everyone and also Europeans are better and you're all terrible. Now, what's true though is that if you have good policies, right? Like if you change zoning rules and you paint bike lanes, like lifestyles will change in response to that. Like we don't just pick lifestyles out of nowhere. It's shaped by the policy environment. And so we should keep those lifestyle feedbacks in mind. But I don't think it's like the biggest Green New Deal backlash was about some stray line about hamburgers, right? Because it's so personal to people. And like developing alt meats and stuff like that, it's really important. It's really important on substance. But, people just like don't want to be told that like you should go be some whole other person.
I'm so glad you brought up meat alternatives. So I am not vegan, but I do eat Morningstar vegan chicken nuggets every single day. And it's because I like them more than real chicken nuggets. And I think that is a space of lifestyle change that people feel extremely sensitive about. Matt brought this up. It was the narrative in Fox News after the Green New Deal was introduced. They were talking about how how Democrats were stealing your hamburgers and whatnot. And I think that's an area where like we just need to make meat alternatives more desirable for people. And I think we'll see an increase in folks like myself who eat less meat because I like those chicken nuggets more. And I think I wanted to also talk about lifestyle change. To the extent that we can, we should make people feel that climate policies and these changes to their lifestyles can actually make their lives better. So for instance, in Texas, after the power outages this year, we found increased support for policies that would make grid reliability more prominent in Texas and improve grid resilience. So it makes sense when people are seeing the negative impacts of climate and the status quo on their lives that they would feel more positively toward changes that can make these problems they're already facing less prominent. And I also wanted to answer Leah's question. To what extent, at what point does behind the scenes climate policy harm the climate movement? I would say like when you're in the midst of a legislative fight, you need to be strategic about the things you talk about publicly. And the fact that the climate movement isn't talking about the CEPP that much is really helpful, like I said in my opening statements. And I think after, if and when, hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll see what happens, we get a reconciliation package that has really robust climate investments in it, we can publicly kind of celebrate this as a big climate win. But to the extent that the president and folks in Congress are talking about this bill as an infrastructure and jobs package and maybe climate secondarily, I think that's really helpful. And I don't think it's harmful for the climate movement. We can say for us, it's the climate bill. But for the American people, there are other issues that they perhaps would feel more impacted by. And it doesn't hurt our movement, in my opinion, to talk about climate in the most popular way and to celebrate the wins once their kind of pen has been put to paper and legislation has been passed. Eat your Morningstar nuggets, you guys, they're great.
I keep wanting to do a review of different vegan alternatives to chicken nuggets. So we'll see what happens there. I think we'll take one more audience question and then finish up.
Hello, my name is Dennis Cardoza. I'm a former member of Congress, and I wanted to comment on just the last 2 points. I think you guys have been a great panel, and quiet things happen in Congress. There was a comment that politicians don't talk about it as much, but there are incredibly important quiet things that happen. I happened to be in the room the day that Nancy Pelosi told a group of members that wanted to delay the incandescent light transfer to LEDs, and they wanted to stop the legislation for 10 years to allow industry to catch up. And she politely but very sternly said, absolutely not, we're not doing that. End of story. And the policy went into effect. So that was an example in my mind of the quiet policy and the politicians just doing what was right when nobody was really looking and seeing. The second thing I wanted to just mention is we're talking about the credit issue. There's a thing called PAYGO in Congress, and I was part of the group that got PAYGO put in place. Unfortunately, it's not working the way we intended it to work. And the Congressional Budget Office counts credit as the entire amount of money that's being spent. They don't think that it gets paid back. So it scores when they're doing bills as the full amount of the credit instead of just what could be expected to be lost to the federal government when people didn't pay it back. And that's a big difference. And so one of the things we can focus on is making sure that PAYGO change on credit issues really allows robust financing of these projects. I just want to make those 2 comments. Thanks.
Abolishing PAYGO is good climate policy.
Hi, thank you for a terrific panel. I'm Kelly Wanzer. I'm the founder and CEO of a nonprofit called Silver Lining. And we're here at the Eco-Modernism event, and we had an opening talk on nuclear. And so I wanted to get the panel's comments on the role of quiet climate policy with respect to not just to sort of boring technocratic things, but some more controversial or taboo or hard to fit in the loud climate policy areas like the one I work on, which is climate intervention technology.
All right, back to the panel.
I can start off responding to the most recent question. I think nuclear is certainly a a touchy subject in the climate movement. And my view on this has certainly changed. I live in Brooklyn now, and in New York State, we had the climate movement aligning behind closing down the Indian Point nuclear site, and then saw emissions increase in New York. So I think this is an area where we certainly need to evolve our thinking. I know mine has. I will say, like, the trepidation and skepticism around nuclear is justified in some ways. I think we haven't seen enough conversation in the nuclear space around environmental justice and equity. And I think to the extent that we can kind of learn from the mistakes that the nuclear siting of the past has had is helpful. And I think it's an area where the climate movement is going to have some reckoning. And it's an area where I disagree with some of my friends in the movement. I'll say that. I might get in trouble for saying this, but I think the emissions dynamic of nuclear is really clear here. So
I'm just gonna, sorry, Matt, last thoughts, and I'm gonna have to jump in as a good virtual moderator.
I agree with that, but also that, it's important to keep in mind that we have these fights about the old nuclear plants, where I think it's just really clear cut that shutting them down is a mistake, and that's happening in a mass politics arena. But like forward looking, the questions about nuclear relate to a lot of sort of nuanced regulatory issues. It's not just kind of like emotionally, do I want to be pro or con? It's, do we have a framework where we can get there? And it's a space where you see the limits of just like a pure R&D strategy, because building things in the physical world is challenging, right? It's a hard engineering problem. It's a hard permitting problem. Where things are located matters a great deal to people. And you eventually have to like take ideas out of the lab and into the real world. And that's true of nuclear, but as solar gets to bigger and bigger scale, I mean, that's also an issue. Like they're big utility scale solar plants, and they have to go somewhere, and people care about where they are, and it's hard to build things. And the country as a whole has gotten like really bad at executing large projects in the physical universe, and we have to fix that.
All right, thank you so much, everyone. I think that just to wrap up, I think that quiet climate policy, while we may disagree, I mean, Mark has said a couple of times, I'm not sure if this is quiet or I'm not sure if this is loud. But I think it's a very useful framework and paradigm to use to think through some of the combinations of policies that we might see moving forward. And so let's just have a big round of applause for our panelists. And thanks so much for organizing.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you, Marcella, for all of the acting very cool as I took like 8 mics away from you.